Okay, so as promised, something completely different now. The next two chapters are all going to be primarily based around uh, respiratory gases and respiration. And when we think about respiratory gases, really the two big ones, there are a couple of others, but really the two big ones that we're super important, super worried about are oxygen and carbon dioxide. Obviously, we need oxygen for a variety of reasons, mostly in its role as an electron receptor in cellular respiration, right? The whole electron transport chain thing. Carbon dioxide, we require, vertebrates anyway, require carbon dioxide as part of a important buffer system maintaining blood pH at appropriate levels. Carbon dioxide plus water makes bicarbonate, carbonic acid, and those two go back and forth to keep blood pH where it has to be. It is, of course, also one of the primary waste products of cellular respiration. So, when we talk about gases in general, not just these two, but gases in general moving, they move in your body either via diffusion at the sort of small level, so into and out of cells, or in bulk flow, right? And that bulk flow is something we're going to call convection. Occasionally, carbon dioxide is actively transported, right? Oxygen never, carbon dioxide sometimes, yes. All right, so if I can get this to work here. There we go. So one other thing we need to think about when we talk about the action of gases is what are they in, right? Are they in a gas form? Are they dissolved in an aqueous solution in water? Both cases are relevant to us. But they're going to behave slightly differently, so we need to be aware of those properties. In a gas, right, we rely on a couple of different gas laws, primarily Dalton's law of partial pressures. Okay, and basically Dalton's law says that the pressure exerted by a gas is proportional to the percent of the overall total gas that particular gas makes up. Kind of a complicated way to say it. Basically, we can think about atmospheric air, right? And at sea level, so not quite here in Crescent, but you know, it's not too far off of this. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is about 1 atmosphere, conveniently enough, right? No, of course, we named the atmosphere as a unit after atmospheric pressure, but it's neither here nor there. Within atmospheric air, certain gases are more prevalent than others. So example, nitrogen is somewhere around 78, 79% of all of the gas in atmospheric air. Oxygen about 21%. Okay, those of you who are math wizards will know that that is most of 100%. And so the remainder of gases are vanishingly small. But we can take these percentages, right, and use them to calculate what pressure is exerted by each of those gases, right? So if oxygen is about 21% of the air, and the total pressure in the air is 1 atmosphere, okay, well then oxygen exerts about 0.2 or 0.21 atmospheres, right? 21% of 1 atmosphere. Same deal here with nitrogen, right? 78% nitrogen, 1 atmosphere, so nitrogen exerts about 0.78 atmospheres of pressure. That's all wonderful and great, right? The other part of Dalton's law here is that each individual gas behaves as though it is the only gas in solution. Okay, doesn't matter if how many other gases are there, each gas behaves as if it is the only one in the world. This is each gas, therefore, is going on spring break to Florida right now, rather than staying at home like it should. In water, or in other aqueous solutions, gases behave slightly differently. Okay, and that has to do with a property called solubility. Right? And solubility is the, hey Liam, what's up?
I'm just here to grab some
Okay, solubility is the property of a gas to dissolve in water. So some gases have high solubility. Carbon dioxide, for example, has high solubility. A lot of carbon dioxide will go into water. Oxygen, on the other hand, has very low solubility. It really doesn't like to dissolve in water at all. And so in terms of your body, that makes a big difference in terms of how we can transport those things around, right? How much of it will go into blood, how much of it won't go into blood, stuff like that. The other thing that affects a gas's behavior in an aqueous solution is temperature. Okay, cold water will hold more gas than warm water will. Okay, so cold water, for example, has a lot of dissolved oxygen in it, right? When we warm that same water sample up, that oxygen is going to come out of solution. And so, for example, here on our left, right, here we've got a sealed bottle of cold water. At least it was cold when we collected it. We've allowed it to warm to room temperature, right? And as that water warms to room temperature, it cannot hold as much gas. It does not dissolve in water at those warmer temperatures. And so we get the formation of gas bubbles as this oxygen and other gases come out of solution. They're no longer dissolved within it. We can also change solubility based on pressure. Okay, so one of the reasons when you go and you have a frosty beverage of your choice, right, and you open the can or open the bottle and there's that satisfying little tss, right, and then it starts fizzing, that's because more gas will go into solution under greater pressure. And when you open the can or open the bottle, you release that pressure, and all of that gas that's been held in solution comes rushing out. That's why you get foam on a beer, right? Or if you go to a soda fountain, it'll foam over if you don't stop it before the level gets high enough. Regardless of concentration, diffusion occurs under pressure. Okay, so the reason that we care about worrying about Dalton's law of partial pressures, worrying about solubility, worrying about all these things, is that unlike most other things, okay, so when we, for example, we're talking about transport, right, we're worried about getting sodium across a cell membrane under diffusion. It occurs entirely under concentration. But for gases, it's entirely under pressure, and those are not necessarily the same thing, right? So as an example of how that works or how that actually happens, we've got diving beetles. And diving beetles will come to the surface and they will create a little snot bubble of atmospheric air. And they will carry it down with them. And they'll use it like a little respirator, like a little lung, okay? And the way this is going to work, right, is that this little bubble is going to continually absorb oxygen from the water, right, despite one very important difference, okay? So again, remember we talked about the idea that water doesn't hold a lot of oxygen, right? Oxygen does not like to diffuse in it. And so concentration-wise, right, the partial pressure, the concentration of oxygen in water is really low, 0.3 millimoles per liter versus about 8.6 millimoles per liter in the atmosphere. Okay, so if oxygen worked entirely under concentration, it would never dissolve, it would never go from the atmospheric air into the water. Okay, but it does, right? It enters the water until the pressures equilibrate. So the atmospheric pressure, right? Remember, oxygen is about 21% of atmospheric air. So pressure here is about 0.21 atmospheres. And so the pressure in the water of oxygen is also 0.21, right? The pressures equilibrate. Where this comes into play for our beetle here is that our beetle brings this atmospheric air, right? And it uses up some of this oxygen, right? And as it uses this oxygen, right, it decreases its partial pressure. So if we look at the gas inside this little bubble, if our beetle uses half of the available oxygen, right, we go to a concentration of 4.3 millimoles instead of 8.6. This has the effect of lowering the partial pressure of oxygen in the bubble to about 0.1, about half of it. Okay. Now, this 0.1 is significantly lower than the partial pressure of oxygen in the water. Concentration is higher, but partial pressure is lower. Because gases operate under pressure alone, oxygen will leave the water and enter into this little bubble. Right? So it can continue to use this little oxygen bubble long after it would normally have used up all of the oxygen in it, because it will continually refill. This is a problem if you like to go deep sea diving, for example. As you descend to depth, right, the pressure on your body and the fluids in your body increases. So just like our little beer here, right, when that pressure increases, we force more gases into it. Okay. In particular, because you are breathing in atmospheric air here in this little tank, you are forcing a lot of nitrogen into your blood. Okay. Under solution. This isn't a big deal if you go down and then you slowly come back up and you allow those pressures to slowly equilibrate. But if you go down and you rapidly come up, those gases that have been forced into your blood very quickly do the beer thing, right? You get these big bubbles of gas inside your blood. That's bad, right? Bubbles of gas inside your blood can cause death, okay? It can, in fact, kill you. So this is a phenomenon called bends, right? It's usually just extremely painful, but it can be fatal. And again, it has everything to do with being underwater, under high pressure, having gas forced into your blood, and rising too quickly to allow those pressures to slowly let that gas off, rather than kind of coming up and opening the top of your beer and foaming all over, right? Generally bad. When we talk about diffusive rates, diffusion of gases is much more rapid through other gases than it is through water, right? You're on an elevator, somebody gets on with a lot of perfume on, you can smell it right away, right? Those perfume molecules diffuse through the air very, very quickly. Underwater would not happen so fast, okay? This presents a problem to animals that lay eggs on the beach, like sea turtles, right? Because those sea turtles are still breathing atmospheric air. They're exchanging gas across the egg shell. So if the eggs are laid too low, okay, so they're laid too close to the water, when the tide comes in, those eggs get submerged, partial pressure of oxygen around the egg drops off a cliff, and that can actually cause the eggs to die. The other thing that we need to think about when we think about diffusion, right, and this is something that we've talked about before, is that diffusion only works when the object is very small, right? It works really well for things like larval fish, things that are less than a millimeter thick, okay? And so things that are that size are often born without circulatory systems, are born without elaborate respiratory systems, because they can get all of their gases simply by diffusion. That's wonderful. But as they grow, right, we're going to need to see organogenesis of things like circulatory systems, of things like respiratory systems. Otherwise, we're going to be limited to being in the realm of the very, very, very small. When we get above the very, very, very small, right, this is when we need to worry about bulk flow or convection, right? So we can talk about bulk. Getting better at this. Bulk flow slash convection. In an animal, right, this is ventilation and circulation. right? And this is much, much, much faster than diffusion because we're pushing it. We're providing some pressure to move it in a direction rather than something allowing it to kind of take its own whim. This can take the form of either, let me pull my laser pointer again, either unidirectional flow. So we think about the circulatory system, for example, right? Blood only flows in one direction, okay? Or it can take the form of tidal flow, like your lung, right? You breathe in and you breathe back out. You breathe in and you breathe back out. Both mechanisms are in place in a lot of different animals. Some have only one, some have both. Doesn't really matter. We also see examples of animals using bulk flow or convection, this sort of fluid flow, to not only aerate themselves, but also to aerate their living spaces. So things like prairie dogs build their nests in a very specific way. And they do so with two different entrances. We have one entrance kind of on low ground, right? And one entrance here on high ground. And the reason this becomes important, the reason the high ground, low ground thing is important, not just for dueling Anakin Skywalker on Mustafar, right? But because as air rushes across the ground, right, as it comes up and over, right, it has to follow Bernoulli's principle. And Bernoulli's principle is very, very simple. It's not simple, but we're going to make it simple. Basically, the idea is that air, so air here moving this way and air here moving this way, both have to get from point A to point B in the same amount of time. Okay, if you're up here, it's a straight line. But if you're down here, it's a curvy line, right? And this curvy line is much longer than the straight line, but you still have the same amount of time to get there, right? So the air coming up and over this wing or this hill, as the case might be, right, has to move faster than the air around it. As it moves faster, right, the faster air moves, the lower pressure it's under. Okay, so the air moving here and the air moving here, slower, higher pressure, faster, lower pressure, which causes suction, right, which causes air to be pulled down, around, and up and through here, aerating these tunnels. In animals, we look at convection and diffusion kind of alternating, right, in terms of their behaviors. So we're going to start with convection, right, with ventilation as we bring in respiratory gases, okay? Then we change to diffusion, right, as those gases then get pulled into a circulatory fluid of some sort, blood, hemolymph, whatever. That blood or hemolymph then travels around the body in bulk flow, right, back to convection again. And then at the cells of the tissues, we go back to diffusion, right? So we diffuse from one cell into another. So convection, diffusion is kind of the name of the game for respiratory systems. Now, transport of oxygen in particular follows what we call the oxygen cascade, okay? And the reason we have this oxygen cascade is that through all of the steps in our respiratory pathway, convection, diffusion, ventilation, diffusion, circulation, diffusion, we lose a little bit of oxygen, right? Because the only way any of this stuff works, all these diffusive processes, right, rely on equilibrating pressures. And as we get rid of gases, pressure lowers, and so we can only meet that particular pressure. What that means for us, okay, in actual fact, as we breathe in air, okay, so there's air in the outside world, and for reasons we'll get to in the next chapter, air inside the lung. The air inside the lung is partially stale, so it is at a much lower concentration of oxygen than the atmospheric air, and thus at a lower pressure. And so it is only this pressure that we can use to drive oxygen into the blood. All right, so here's the first drop off in our cascade from atmospheric air to the gas in your lungs. There's a small drop off from lungs to blood, and then a big drop off from blood, right, to the interstitial tissue, interstitial fluids. right? So we lose a lot of oxygen as we travel around, right? And beyond that, then, as we get from the extracellular fluids here into the cells themselves, we have another big drop off in oxygen, okay? This last little bit, right, this partial pressure here at the mitochondria, this is all the pressure that we've got to actually drive oxygen in there so we can actually have cellular respiration, okay? This partial pressure must not drop below 0.001 atmospheres, otherwise it is insufficient, and we will not actually have anything happen. Okay, so kind of going back to one of the original ideas we've got here, kind of trying to begin to wrap up this chapter. Life in water, life in the air, very, very different, right? And one of the big reasons for that, in terms of respiration anyway, is that, of course, the concentrations of gases are substantially different. If we look at life in air, for example, concentration of oxygen at a variety of temperatures is pretty high in all cases. So 0 degrees freezing, 24 degrees fairly warm. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 200 mils per liter, right? Which is pretty good. Okay, doesn't change a whole lot with temperature. It's always pretty high. Life is easy. Okay, we live in water, however. A couple of important things really happen right off the bat. Number one, we're going to top out, right, at a much lower concentration of oxygen, right? For fresh water, our best is going to be about 10 mils per liter. Seawater, about 8 mils per liter. And the reason there's a difference here, right, is that as we're cramming stuff into water, the more stuff that's already there, the less room there is for oxygen. So if we're in seawater, we've got all these dissolved salts and stuff, and that's taking up space between the molecules that we could normally cram oxygen in. So seawater will always have a lower concentration of oxygen. The other thing that's going to happen here, right, is that as we get warmer, right, we can really experience massive declines, right, almost 50%, right, somewhere around 50, 60% of the initial oxygen or the maximum oxygen concentration at warm water temperatures. We've talked about this before, right? That's a big deal. So if you're going to live in the water, you have to process an awful lot more fluid per unit time, okay? And if you live in warm water, that's doubly true. The other part that's a problem here, right, is that water, as we've talked about, is more viscous. It's harder to move. It's harder to ventilate. So not only do you have to move more of it per unit time, but it's also harder to do, okay? So one of the reasons that we see limitations on metabolic rates for aquatic organisms, right? We don't see endothermic aquatic organisms other than mammals. And we see no water-breathing animals that are endothermic, is because of these energetic requirements. The bar to get oxygen is already so high that you can't make it any harder than it already is. Final thing we'll talk about with this particular chapter, and we'll close it off, the notion of a respiratory environment. As you use respiratory gases, as you expel respiratory gases, you alter the local partial pressures around you, okay? Now, if you're in an open environment, right, it doesn't matter, right? It's only extremely local. You're not going to use up all the oxygen in the air around you if you're outside, okay? But if you're in a closed room, you absolutely can, right? And so whether you're the conditions that you're in, right, your usage of those gases or the usage of gases by a plant, right, which would be the opposite of yours, whatever is going to potentially drastically alter not only your local environment, but also the general environment around you. That can have some pretty devastating effects. Okay, so in the next chapter, we're going to go on, we're going to look at how animals actually ventilate, right? So both fish, air-breathing animals, stuff like that. And talk a little bit about lung structure, which is surprisingly complicated.